Yes, thanks for inviting me again. I want to comment here on an article I have recently published in Ukrainian, German, and Russian, which is a longer version of an earlier brief note I published with the European Council on Foreign Relations on a discussion in Germany in summer 2017, when a prominent German politician, Christian Lindner, suggested to perceive the Crimea issue as a permanent provisorium, as he called it. So that was a then very prominent comment by Lindner on the Crimea issue, and I commented back then on this in English. But then I realized that it is maybe useful to write a longer article on the Crimea issue, on the issue of the annexation for the German public, that would outline a few topics that I think have not been yet properly commented on in the expert sphere by journalists and also by academia. So what is usually very well commented on in academia and also in journalism, in the public sphere in general, is the legal aspect of Crimea's annexation of 2014. There have been a number of books published on this already. I think you have already in your program, William, interviewed Tom Grant from Cambridge, who published a book on the various legal issues of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. There's also an older book collected by the late Oleksandr Zadorozhnii, international law professor who died last year and who collected a seminal book in 2014 on legal aspects of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. He also then published in 2015 a monograph on the Soviet interpretation of international, or the post-Soviet Russian interpretation of international law after the Crimea annexation. And there was also in 2015 a conference organized by the Polish Center for Russian-Polish Dialogue in Warsaw, out of which came an important collected volume edited by Czapliński on specifically on various legal aspects of the annexation of Crimea. There's also in Germany already a whole series of publications on the international legal aspects of the annexation. There were published in 2014 and 2015 two seminal, I would say, articles by a prominent German legal scholar called Otto Luchterhandt, that is a professor emeritus in Hamburg, who published two very important papers in the journal Osteuropa in 2014 and in 2015, I think, in the important international law journal Archiv für Völkerrecht, Archive for International Law, in German language. There were also two important, or even three important papers in English language by a Heidelberg-based scholar called Christian Marxsen, who published at least three, I think, articles on the annexation of Crimea and the legal aspects of this. There was an important article by a prominent German legal scholar called Anna Peters, who published specifically on the pseudo-referendum on Crimea, also in the context of other similar pseudo-referenda in the post-Soviet sphere. And there were other scholars in Germany and in the West in general, also in Ukraine, who have extensively commented on the legal aspects of the annexation of Crimea. And I think there's very little actually to add to this. The one thing I will be adding in the future to this is that I'm currently collecting, together with a London-based scholar called Gergana Yankova-Dimova, volume where we will put together various scholarly papers in German and in English on the annexation of Crimea, and just to collect the various papers that have been spread in several journals and books, specifically on the legal aspects of the annexation of Crimea. But these will be rather republications of already published papers and not so much novel research, also, although some papers in this volume will be also specifically written for this volume. So I'm saying all this just to illustrate that this is basically an issue that is fairly well covered. The other issue connected to the annexation of Crimea, I think that is increasingly well covered, are the rights of the Crimean Tatars. There is a very active group in Ukraine that extensively comments and documents the violations of the various human rights violations during the annexation and after the annexation of politically active Crimean Tatars in Ukraine. And there's a lot to be said about this. But my impression is that this is already rather well covered. For instance, the Kharkiv group on human rights, and a scholar there called Halia Konyash is writing very frequently on this issue and documenting this particular problem of the annexation of Crimea. So my article that I published in a German open access journal called Sirius, Zeitschrift für strategische Analysen, Sirius Journal for Strategic Analysis, and also on the websites of Vox Ukraine and Historians in UA, in Ukrainian and Russian. This paper is about different issues in the legal annexation of Crimea, namely about the political circumstances of the referendum, or the pseudo-referendum, I would say, in March 2014. The second issue I'm dealing there are the various opinion polls before and after the pseudo-referendum of 2014. And the third topic I'm dealing there are the historical justifications that, or pseudo-justifications that various Russian commentators have proposed to apologize, to justify the annexation of Crimea. And in a way, for a Ukrainian public, I think these are sort of rather obvious themes. What I'm writing there is basically information that is freely available, that one can basically collect from sites like Wikipedia, and that is not particularly original. But the stunning thing about these historical facts of the relationship between the Crimean Peninsula and Ukraine on the one side, and the Crimean Peninsula and the current Russian Federation on the other side, some of the most basic facts, I think, are not very well reflected upon in the Western press, and also not in the Western expert community. Among the experts, maybe just because the facts here are so obvious that they are almost, that it seems almost useless or making no sense to mention them. Some very basic facts about the geography and history of Crimea and its relation to mainland Ukraine and to the Russian Federation. So what I'm dealing there with are these three topics: the pseudo-referendum, the opinion polls, and the history. And with regard to the pseudo-referendum, I'm dealing there with the circumstances of this referendum, that it was obviously a referendum that was conducted under dubious circumstances, and that in general, I think there is a misunderstanding here about the annexation, and I think that's actually the central issue, that the legal or the de jure annexation has happened only on the 18th of March. But the most important thing about the whole process is that the de facto annexation of Crimea happened a couple of weeks before, and that Crimea was taken over by Russia de facto before it was taken over de jure, and that this de facto takeover of Crimea already in late February, one could say, by Russian troops without signs, conditioned then the whole process of the secession, the alleged declaration for independence, the conduct of the pseudo-referendum, and then eventually the official annexation. So this is the most important thing to consider here about this whole process, is that the actual annexation, the change of political power in Crimea happened before the official switch of Crimea from the Ukrainian state to the Russian Federation, at least in the Russian interpretation of it. And in a way, the dubiousness of this whole process is illustrated by a fact I'm not mentioning actually in my article, but which I may as well mention here, is that the man who was installed as the prime minister of Crimea by Russia after the de facto takeover of the Crimean parliament in Simferopol is a man called Sergei Aksyonov, who is the head of a was the head of a small party called Russkoye Единство, Russian Unity, which had received in the local elections on Crimea in 2010 around 4% of support. And this degree of support, in a way, is for Aksionov's party is an illustration of the dubiousness of this takeover. But I mentioned in my article a whole number of different aspects that illustrate that. And what is particularly revealing here is that one of the most critical assessments of the pseudo-referendum came from a group of human rights activists who are members of the official Human Rights Council of the Russian Federation, not of Ukraine, but of the Russian Federation. And this Human Rights Council of the Russian Federation is an official advisory organ of nobody else than Vladimir Putin. And these three human rights activists, they published an unofficial report in April 2014 after one of them had privately visited Crimea, and they reported very different numbers for the participation of Crimeans in the pseudo-referendum, and also for the support of Crimeans for the annexation in the pseudo-referendum. And all of this means that if one believes this unofficial report by the three human rights activists from the Human Rights Council of the Russian Federation, that perhaps in the pseudo-referendum, less than a third of the population of Crimea has actually supported the annexation. So this is a rather revealing story in the whole analysis of this event, namely that this very critical report was published by Russian human rights activists who are moreover members of an official advisory organ of the president of Russia. In connection with that, I deal then also with the various opinion polls after and before the annexation of Crimea. And basically what appears here is that the support that the three human rights activists reported in the annexation with regard to the referendum on the pseudo-referendum on the annexation, that the support that they report in their statement is rather similar to the earlier measured support in the Crimean population for an annexation, and that means that between 40 and 60%, usually in the opinion polls before the annexation, had supported when asked about an annexation this option. So this is something similar, but because of the low participation in the annexation referendum or pseudo-referendum, actually, this then means that, as I mentioned already, there was perhaps less than a third of the electorate that actually voted for the annexation. There was also an important research project by a British scholar called Eleanor Knott in 2012-2013, who did field research on Crimea, and who had, I think, around 70 respondents with whom she conducted in-depth interviews, and where she found where she identified different groups, and she found that actually there was no explicit support for annexation among any of the different types of Crimeans that she identified, and even not about the clearly pro-Moscow people on whom she interviewed. And the thesis that she then has offered in her paper on this research in a collected volume on Russian nationalism published last year is that these pro-Moscow Crimeans did not support annexation because they feared war and instability, and that they were basically perhaps not particularly happy about their situation as being citizens of Ukraine on Crimea, but that they still did not support annexation. Although they were supportive of this issue in principle, but they feared the instability that would arise out of that, and then actually spoke out against it. And then the issue then, of course, is that after the annexation, the support in opinion polls for the annexation rises and is about twice as large as in the opinion polls before the annexation. And I offer in my article three explanations for this. Basically, first, the same logic that earlier applied to the pro-Moscow Crimeans who were against an annexation operation then also applies the same logic of sort of path dependency to the Crimeans after annexation, namely that people were simply then, when asked voting for in opinion polls, voting for the status quo, that they feared yet another change of borders and were therefore supporting the already completed annexation. Then one has to count in the enormous risks that the people encounter who would like to perhaps say something against the annexation or who would be actually in favor or of a return of Crimea to Ukraine. And also one would have to count in the enormous defamation campaign that is going on in Russian mass media. And since March 2014, the mass media on Crimea has been entirely dominated by the Kremlin, and that this then jump in support for the annexation in the population of Crimea has to take this into account. So this is the second issue. And finally, the third issue that I'm dealing with in this article is perhaps the most interesting one. It's this whole discussion about the the alleged historical arguments for an inclusion of Crimea into the Russian Federation. And I think the big misunderstanding here, also sometimes found among Western scholars who should know better about the history of Crimea, is the basic misunderstanding here is that Crimea never belonged to a Russian nation state. Crimea belonged to the Tsarist Empire and then to the Soviet Union. And not only the Russian Federation were parts of the Tsarist Empire and the Soviet Union, but also the larger part of the current Ukrainian state were, of course, parts of the Tsarist Empire and of the Soviet Union. And therefore, this whole argument that Crimea was disunited from its Russian home in 1991, I'm now sort of reproducing the Kremlin narrative, and then was allegedly reunited with the Russian, with the Russian homeland in 2014, is simply bogus. Because, of course, in 1783, when Crimea was annexed by the Tsarist Empire, by the Tsar Catherine the Great, left bank Ukraine was already a part of the Tsarist Empire. Shortly after the annexation of Crimea in 1783, also right bank Ukraine, central Ukraine, became part of the Tsarist Empire, and also Volhynia shortly afterwards became parts of the Russian empires, or the Tsarist Empire. And so this Russia, to which also the question in the referendum referred, was actually never existed in that way. What existed was the Russian Empire, and both the Russian Federation and the Ukrainian current state are successor states of this empire. And the same then also goes, of course, for the Soviet Union. Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union as much as the Russian Federation. It is true that for the first years of the existence of the Soviet Union until 1954, Crimea was part of the Russian Soviet Republic, and then only then afterwards it became part of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. But in a way, this is insubstantial, because the Soviet Union, as we know, was a totalitarian state, and this change between from the Russian Soviet Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic was, in fact, a politically largely inconsequential move. It was determined in 1954 by economic considerations and by the simple fact that geographically, geologically, economically, of course, Crimea belongs to Ukraine in terms of its infrastructure as well, and therefore it was only logical that Crimea would be part of the Soviet Republic, and the switch from the Russian Soviet Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic was largely a reaction to the devastation of Crimea during World War II, and as a result of the deportation of the Crimean Tatars in 1944. And so this whole argument about the alleged belonging of Crimea to Russia is actually a play with words. Russia has, in its argumentation in the international sphere, but also in the formulation of its pseudo-referendum in 2014, basically just switched terms and played with the terms Russia, Russian Federation, Russian Empire, and thereby, among surprisingly many Western observers, created the impression that Crimea is a sort of Russian land, although in fact, as I mentioned, it had only belonged to the empire to which Ukraine belonged as much as the current Russian Federation belonged. In fact, one could argue that, for instance, the belonging of Crimea to the Tauric gouvernement from 1802 till 1917 in the Tsarist Empire could be used as an argument for Crimea to belong to Ukraine rather than the Russian Federation, because the Tauric gouvernement comprised not only the Crimean Peninsula but also the southeastern mainland part of Ukraine. And if you look, for instance, on the polling of the population of the Tsarist Empire of 1897, then in this whole Tauric Empire, The relatively largest language group were the Ukrainian-speaking subjects of the Tsarist Empire, and only and the Russian speakers in the Tauric gouvernement as a whole were only the second largest language group. And also, if you look on the data for the Crimean Peninsula from 1897, more specifically, then the largest ethnic group on Crimea were the Crimean Tatars still, that changed shortly afterwards, and the Russians were only the second largest group in 1897. And as you know, as we know, of course, today the Crimean Tatars are very pro-Ukrainian, which has a lot to do with the approach to Stalin in the Russian Federation, or in the both in Soviet times and in post-Soviet times, and the entirely different approach to Stalin in independent Ukraine after 1991. And so the entire story and narrative that the Kremlin has presented in the international sphere about the allegedly, important historical reasons why Crimea should belong to the Russian Federation rather than Ukraine are bogus. If you look at this more carefully, this entire argument is just a play with words and with concepts, and doesn't make sense. And maybe the final odd episode to mention here is that there was in the pseudo-referendum a second question asked to the population of Crimea, which was in a way even more dubious than the first one. The first one mentioned this, as I've just outlined, bizarre idea of a воссоединение, a reunification of Crimea with Russia, although, as I mentioned, Crimea had never belonged to a Russian nation state. It only had belonged to the Tsarist and then Soviet Empire. And in the second question that the Crimeans were asked, there was no option, first of all, to vote for the status quo. So the Crimeans could not vote in this pseudo-referendum for the preservation of the then present state of affairs, namely for the preservation of the 1998 constitution of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. They could only vote in this pseudo-referendum for a return to the 1992 constitution of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. The odd thing about this question was that there were two constitutions in 1992, two versions of the Crimean constitution in 1992, in May 1992 and in September 1992. And these two versions were rather different. And the first, the May 1992 constitution of Crimea was somewhat more confederative, one could say, in that it emphasized very much the independence of Ukraine, although in Article 9, if I remember that correctly, of this constitution, Ukraine was mentioned as belonging to Ukraine, but still this was a constitution that very much was emphasizing the independence of Crimea. And then the September 1992 constitution was a more sort of federal constitution, in that it sort of more explicitly defined Crimea already in Article 1 as a part of Ukraine. So these were rather different texts, and the odd thing about the pseudo-referendum in March 2014 was that it wasn't clear to which of these two constitutions actually the second question in the referendum referred. And there was no third question. These were the two options that were the the voters were given either annexation to the Russian Federation or return to the 1992 constitution, and it wasn't mentioned which of the two constitutions actually would be then valid. So this was a really bizarre also aspect of this whole referendum, that both of the questions in the referendum were actually absurd, in that Crimea was promised in the first question the reunification with a Russian nation state to which it had never belonged. And in the second question, it was then the Crimeans were asked about a constitution that was not clearly defined in the question. So these are just two illustrations of the dubiousness of this whole operation. But still, today we find many politicians, diplomats, journalists, and even sometimes experts who would refer to the pseudo-referendum of March 2014 as a justification for the annexation. So these were just the aspects that I tried to line out in this article. As I mentioned, I think for sort of experts on Ukraine, and also for many Ukrainians, these are probably rather obvious things that I stated. They are not particularly original and interesting, and they simply were collected by me in order to illustrate for a Western readership the lacking foundation, the lacking sociological foundation, the lacking political foundation, and also the lacking historical foundation for the annexation of Crimea. Neither the political process that happened in spring 2014, nor the sociology that was present before the annexation of Crimea, nor the history of Crimea are in fact can in fact be used to justify the annexation. All of that rather speaks, if you look more closely on it, out for Crimea belonging to Ukraine. I'm also sort of have stated this in this article because I think sometimes the Ukrainian arguments are a little bit too unsophisticated in when there are encounters with these sort of fake news and false narratives from Russia, which are then taken also often over by Western observers. Often Ukrainian commentators would simply say that this was an illegal act and there's no historical political foundation for the annexation of Crimea. And often Ukrainian observers will not actually, or commentators will not actually engage with the Russian arguments. I've tried to engage here with the Russian arguments and have tried to dissect them. And I think that needs to be done more in the future. So this, my article is not a particularly deep article. I think historians, political scientists, sociologists could delve much more deeply into the issues I've tackled there. My argument that I've provided there is simply a survey of some issues that demand further and more serious historical, political, and sociological research.